Life Curriculum, learning to address impairment and fatigue to enhance patient safety.
Hey, John, I'm seeing your patient, Ms. Hellstrom, for an acute visit.
Yeah.
She's showing a very interesting response to the SSRI that you prescribed to her several weeks ago. I'd like you to join me in seeing her.
Well, Dr. Shaw, I'm really behind right now, okay? I've got several other patients to wait on.
Oh, well, I understand, but this is a great opportunity to see some of the serious effects of SSRIs in a patient with bipolar disorder. Plus, we're also going to have to make some decisions about how to best intervene for her antidepressant-induced
I have
manias.
complete trust in your judgment on handling this. Okay, look, I am really behind today, and I promised my wife that I'd have dinner with her tonight, which, as you know, is also very important.
Listen, Dr. Meeker, you're the one who prescribed this drug with potentially serious side effects and no follow-up. Now, as a physician, you have an obligation to your patients first and foremost. This patient is in a serious situation because of your actions. It's your responsibility to ensure that she receives the correct treatment and to bring her back to a safe baseline. You need to learn that as a physician, the day does not end until the work is done. You can be assured that there's going to be serious consequences.
In this vignette, the generational differences between Dr. Shaw and Dr. Meeker have produced a barrier between them that prevents the understanding of each other's attitudes. In fact, generational differences are a very common cause of misunderstanding and tension, not only in residency programs, but in virtually all workplaces today. Let's see a more productive way in which Dr. Shaw could handle Dr. Meeker's reply.
Dr. Meeker, this is a learning opportunity that would be unfortunate for you to miss. There's no better way to learn about potential actions of antidepressants in different patients than to get the experience firsthand.
Sure.
Now, even though you may have a valid reason for missing this opportunity, I will want to speak with you about it. Can we set up a time to meet tomorrow?
Okay. I'll stop by your office.
Excellent.
Great.
So, John, I just wanted to touch base with you about what happened between us yesterday. To pass on a teaching moment like that, it just left me puzzled. You were so intent on wanting to be on time for dinner with your wife that I had to ask myself if everything was all right at home with you.
I know that you were upset with me, and I just figured that there would be a lot of chances for me to see mania. And in fact, I've seen it several times in medical school and a few times in residency. Yes, everything at home is great. I think that my making time for my wife is helping keep it that way. I do feel that I missed something with Miss Hellstrom by what happened, and I have learned from it. I neglected to screen her for bipolar disorder. How is she? Did you prescribe lithium for her?
Yeah, that's exactly what I did. She wasn't suicidal, but she was pretty wired yesterday, and she was engaging in some high-risk behaviors, and we'll see how the lithium does for her. I'd like you to give her a call today to see how she's doing.
Of course.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right, sure.
This vignette is an example of the different ways that generations view the work-life balance. Even though it is difficult for Dr. Shaw to understand Dr. Meeker's choices in this situation, in the second outcome, he suggests that they communicate about it at another time convenient for Dr. Meeker. He is trying to keep the communication lines open, trying to respect generational differences, and he doesn't immediately judge Dr. Meeker as irresponsible or disinterested or unprofessional.
Sometimes I just don't get these residents. The way they approach life is so foreign to me. I've dedicated my career, my life to medicine, and I would never pass on a teaching moment. All else comes second, even at times my family. My family has always understood that the patients needed to come first. That's part of my being a doctor. On the other hand, a part of me is envious of John's ability to set limits at work. I don't know how to do that. I've never known how to do that.
There is no doubt that medicine, traditionally considered a stable profession, is now in a state of flux. Physician demographics are changing as well. As in the general population, the physician population is aging, with 38% of physicians in the U.S. 50 years old and older. Within the younger population, women constitute a higher percentage of physicians. Physicians today have to be able to adapt to transitions that include insurance policy changes, federal regulation changes, changes in the economic climate, and the ever-present medical liability challenge. For academic physicians, the pressure to generate clinical revenues is crowding out time for patient care, teaching, and research. The medical workplace is also changing. Not only do physicians have to be culturally competent in terms of the patients they treat, but also in terms of managing diversity within the healthcare system. Some of the major cultural influences are the feminization of medicine, the wide variety and ethnic backgrounds of healthcare providers, and the cultural differences of the generations that currently exist in the workforce.
So how do people adapt to rapid change? How do we prepare residents for a lifetime of change? Another term for being able to adapt to change is resilience. We can also think of resilience as the ability to cope with difficult times and come out stronger from the experience. Even though all physicians are faced with changes, research has shown that residents and younger physicians are less resilient, that is, less able to bounce back than the older, more experienced physicians. A critical influence that is necessary for promoting resilience is maintaining caring connections with people involved in one's personal and work life. Therefore, a resident's resilience is very much influenced by the quality of relationships with faculty and other senior physicians. Put in another way, a key to resident resilience is effective mentoring, modeling, and communication. Running counter to the promotion of resilience are the tensions that develop between younger and older physicians as they try to practice together. Some of the major divisive issues are work hour expectations, evaluation and promotion, and lifestyle balance. The tensions resulting from different generational views of these issues often serve as a major source of distress, burnout, and ultimately of organizational dysfunction. Therefore, learning to understand and manage generational differences is both a leadership mandate and a survival skill. And this applies to both contemporary medical leaders and younger physicians alike.
There are 4 broad generational cohorts working in the medical field today that represent an extremely diverse set of backgrounds, including cultural backgrounds and attitudes. Each generation is characterized by historical, political, and social events that have shaped and continue to shape their core values, work ethic, and business approach. Sociologists propose that people resemble the times in which they are born, their generational cohorts, more than they resemble their parents throughout their lifetimes. You only have to consider a person who came of age during the Great Depression and that person's attitudes toward money to recognize the validity of this concept. This older cohort was frequently seen as hoarders. In some ways, we never outgrow the imprints that came with the milieu in which we were born. It's helpful to think of generational issues within the perspective of cultural competence. If we think of cultural competence as an ability to work with people whose beliefs, values, and histories are significantly different from our own, then generational issues emerge as probably the most prevalent challenge to cultural competence in most medical settings. Dr. Craig Ashcroft from the Ohio State University School of Medicine offers helpful comments in this regard. He reminds us that cultural competence is not just about differences in nationality, language, and skin color. It also has to do with differences in views of self, of the world, of cause and effect relationships. And in medicine, cultural competence has to do with different views of the place medicine plays in one's overall scheme of life. In other words, is this a job or a calling? Cultural competence isn't just about language skills. It's more about an attitude. People who are truly culturally competent, Dr. Ashcroft reminds us, are people who are curious, accepting, warm, and respectful of people who are different than themselves. They're people who demonstrate an awareness and want to understand and recognize and show patience concerning differences between themselves and other people. This dialogue between the generations may be our biggest challenge yet, and certainly one that is worth addressing.
The four generations in the workplace today are the silent generation, or traditionalists, born roughly between 1925 and 1945, the baby boomers born between 1945 and 1965, the Gen Xers born between 1965 and 1980, and the Generation Y, or Millennials, born between 1980 and 2001. The values of most of the senior physicians in the workplace are founded on a 200-year-old Judeo-Christian work ethic model, where delayed gratification and unremitting toil served as a central theme. If we compare this to the values of the Gen Xers, for example, that emphasize developing an acceptably balanced lifestyle, it's easy to see where clashes can occur. The younger generations, for example, the Gen Xers and the Millennials, not only strive for flexible work hours and flexible design of the medical practice, but they seem to expect that the medical field has already created and incorporated these types of programs and policies. They assume that they are going to have a fairly balanced life and view a balanced life as being a marker of success. Many researchers have attributed this change in work ethic to the larger percentage of women who are now practicing medicine. We can group generational differences into 6 categories. First, it's important to recognize differences in the educational process and the use of technology. Secondly, there are differences between the interest in and the need to manage one's own career and spending. Third are differences in lifestyle orientation and views of work-life balance. There are also differences in perspectives towards authority, leadership, and relationships.
Let's briefly consider each of these areas. The educational process has been impacted tremendously in the past decade by an explosion in information and new technology. Contrast that with some of the deep wisdom of seasoned physicians that was gained from years of experience and practice. What often emerges is an area of struggle between the younger and older generations. All physicians in training today want to know more and sooner about the business aspects of their medical careers than ever before. But most older physicians came of age in an era in which business aspects of medical practice were not the purview of young physicians. According to the older generations, today's younger generations will spend what is necessary to achieve a more opulent lifestyle than their work has yet earned. According to younger physicians, older physicians sometimes confuse commitment and professionalism with workaholism. They might actively debate whether medicine is a job, a commitment, a calling, the major focus of life, or an aspect of a life that is much more multifaceted. Now, with these concepts as a backdrop, let's look a little more deeply at some of the influences that may have shaped these kinds of attitudes and stereotypes. Remember, the 4 generations in today's medical workplace are the traditionalists, the baby boomers, the Generation Xers, and the millennials.
The traditionalists, born between 1925 and 1945, came of age in an era of self-discipline and denial of immediate gratification. This was an era in which the icons were people like President Eisenhower, General Patton, and Coach Vince Lombardi, all in their middle age and all considered authoritative leaders. An era in which the prevailing ethic in organizations was a hierarchical respect of authority. Age and experience were characteristics to be respected. In medicine, it was an era of stern training. There is a broad gap between these senior physicians and the physicians now in training relative to any demonstration of familiarity or informality on a personal level. This was an era of commitment. Across all industries, the tendency was to get a job and keep that job for the duration of one's career. Show up, do your work, and ask for more. Work was valuable. After all, they had grown up in a time when many people were unemployed. Managing and communicating with traditionalists involved speaking clearly and respectfully while allowing time for responses. Being the least familiar with new technology, but capable of understanding it. This generation responds best to patience when introducing new concepts. For traditionalists, their work is their way of life, and they should be addressed with this in mind. Along came the baby boomers, born between 1945 and 1965, and so named because this is the largest generation. Historians tell us that baby boomers were the first generation where children became a social fixation, as demonstrated by the advertising industry. It was still the case during this era that many of the best, brightest, and most talented women were remaining at home and trying to fulfill the 1950s notion of the single-income family. Women who did enter the workplace primarily went into either nursing or education, and the baby boomer child was afforded a lot of attention. This was the first time in education that awards were given for gets along well with others, and interpersonal dynamics became a focus of educational processes, as did self-esteem building. Baby boomers were very responsive to the cultural messages of the day. Have a dream, go to the moon, and ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And so it became the classic pattern for baby boomers to show up early and stay late in the workplace. Educational challenges were approached with the same sort of mentality. In fact, the word workaholism was invented to describe the baby boomer generation. Baby boomers, however, became jaded by media coverage that demonstrated the foibles and shortcomings of cultural icons and political figures. They participated in the rebellions and the questioning of authority that happened in the 1960s. The Vietnam War and government policies on military deferment led to all-time highs in the number of male applicants to medical school. The women's liberation movement and the civil rights movement were also part of this generation's experience. Now, this baby boomer generation also experienced big double crosses. Divorce rates skyrocketed. Disillusioned companies started going bankrupt right as baby boomers were supposedly going to begin reaping the fruits of their labor. They had worked in the trenches hard for decades, but now the proverbial brass ring was never to be attained. Medicine and medical economics also changed as the public's view of a sacred and revered medical community shifted. In short, a lot of baby boomers in medicine had become rather resentful, wanted less stress, more time for family, and a simpler life. They had been reared in the stern tradition of the traditionalists, but then had not been able to reach the traditional goals. Nonetheless, baby boomers thrive on being known as know-it-alls. Therefore, managing and communication with this generation involves speaking openly and directly and being prepared to answer their many questions. This generation appreciates having accomplishments recognized as well as being offered learning and intellectual challenges.
Along came the next generation, Gen X, who had a very different set of expectations and culturally encouraged notions about how to manage themselves and the whole dynamic of dealing with authority in the medical workplace. Gen X trainees and physicians were born roughly between the years 1965 and 1980. Many of these people were born into dual-income families. Even though the traditional family structure had started to become challenged during the boomer generation, it was now the norm to have both parents working outside the home or single-parent households with the parent employed. Therefore, Gen Xers often came home to an empty house. There was an era of the latchkey generation. This was an era of media explosion and invasion, and in contrast to the 3 television stations that the boomers were limited to, this was the era of satellite television and cable television, with 130 stations. Much of the media focused on exposing the foibles of all of the so-called icons and cultural heroes. A combination of economic and domestic changes seemed to have created a skepticism or hesitation, or anxiety at least, in this cohort of people regarding their willingness to buy into traditional structures and social systems. This translates into anxiety in committing to long-term relationships both at work and at home, and a tendency to raise the question, what's in it for me? Now, what's misunderstood about this generational cohort is also very important. Far from being slackers, this is a generation who learned to be very individually directed in managing complex lives during an era of information explosion. The amount of information and material that had to be learned in order to get through medical school or medical residencies multiplied during this generation's lifetime. While there is more of a demonstration of casualness in dealing with authority than there is respectfulness of the differences between the generations, that does not necessarily translate into stereotypical slacker mentality. In fact, about 90% of Gen Xers state that while they want careers that allow innovation, stimulation, and fun, they also want to find an organization to commit to that will last. Many people in this generation openly demonstrate a quest for training that will increase their marketability. This does not necessarily translate into a questionable long-term commitment in their medical careers, but more likely reflects the fact that so many people in this generation in their formative years were told to plan on changing careers 5 to 6 times because the companies that they would join would be dissolved and/or merged into others.
Managing Generation Xers involves dispelling the myth that they are not serious about their medical careers. Communicating sooner about financial issues is something that this generation demands. Generation Xers also like receiving feedback that includes not just criticism, but also praise for their performance. And they perform better when their opinions are solicited, even if it's clear that they don't get a vote in shaping policy. They certainly are people who respond better to directness than to indirectness and tend to most highly value mentorships or curricula that encourage their individual skill development and cross-training. Finally, given the era in which they came of age, they certainly are people who tend to appreciate the presentation of information on computers that is fast and interactive, perhaps a throwback to the latchkey experience or the impact that divorce had on large numbers of this generation. This is also a generation that seems to be in search of a cohesive team experience. This concept feeds into research about resident well-being that suggests that the cohesiveness of the residency group is a very important positive factor related to well-being. The fourth generation in the medical workplace is the so-called Generation Y or Millennials. These people were born in 1981 and afterward. This is a cohort of people who, at their oldest, have boomer parents, the youngest have young Generation X parents. They are considered to be a work in progress, but in so many ways are held up as hope for combining the best aspects of all prior generations. Certainly, they have had the most special, protected, and enriched lives of any generation heretofore. These people literally grew up online, and research suggests that they spend more time online and on the internet than watching television. And they're lifetime learners. They state that they value flexibility, exciting work, and wanting to do good for others. There's been a sudden increase of interest in joining do-good organizations like the Peace Corps and Teach America in this cohort. More of these people come into medical school clearly stating that they are less concerned about how much money they will make and more concerned about doing good for the world. The millennials are people who have an idealism that is clear, and a sort of throwback to the early 1960s idealism of doing social good. There are also, however, people who have been amply entertained, and so they rank having fun as an essential part of a career and tend to take for granted that the institution will keep them engaged and growing. They are a very culturally diverse group who do not see a lot of difference between the masculine and the feminine in the workplace. Issues of sexism and racism are more foreign to them than any prior cohort. Nearly 100% of millennials say they expect to get married or have some kind of covenant relationship in raising a family. Surveys of medical students demonstrate that these young students and physicians are choosing specialties that provide lifestyle control that they want, along with higher salaries.
In some ways, these millennials are anti-baby boomer. They say boomers talk a lot and are rather hypocritical in their lifestyles. They talk about teamwork but act individualistic. They talk about doing good for the world but are rather workaholic and materialistic. At the same time, they are non-Xers. They see Xers as being rather selfish and materialistic and cynical in a way that they, the millennials, don't buy into. In this sense, you could say that their revolution is their optimism, their cheerfulness, and their positivity about marriage and family, rather than cynicism. They also tend to like their parents. A large percentage of millennials report that they speak on a daily basis with their parents. At best, they are cooperative team players who accept authority and are rule followers. As a quick summary, we can view the trend in Traditionalist to Generation Y work ethic as changing from dedicated and loyal to one where each individual is their own free agent, negotiating their own work-life balance. The trend in the perception of authority and leadership is changing from respect that is based on a hierarchy to the view in younger generations that leadership should be based solely on competence.
The younger generations clearly value collegiality. They want friends who are co-workers. They want to have fun in the workplace. 90% define success as being trusted to do a good job, and 85% claim that they want a job for the long haul. They want to know that they have a career path. They value diversity in an encouraging and nurturing work environment. The younger physicians, particularly the Millenials, certainly are not devoid of their own anxieties. So many, in fact about 78%, according to the book Millennials Rising, report concern about getting a job and being able to keep it.
Diversity in today's residency programs can be found in the large numbers of residents of different cultures and nationalities. In fact, as many as 30% of residents in some specialties are international medical graduates, IMGs, and residency programs in certain states, including New York and New Jersey, may comprise IMGs as a majority. IMGs are seen to be an increasingly important source of potential residents as residency programs seek to fill open slots and strive to help prevent future predicted physician shortages. Nonetheless, bridging gaps among cultures and nationalities in medicine remains a difficult issue. One of the obvious hurdles is the language barrier. Even when IMGs are proficient in the English language, they may not be able to understand nuances, body language, metaphors, medical jargon, and abbreviations. And in the field of medicine, where data often has to be communicated very fast, they can be left at a definite disadvantage. Divergent views of medicine and education can also present hurdles to understanding. IMGs may be from a country where physicians are considered the unquestioned authority, both in terms of treating their patients as well as directing their staff. Women residents from other countries may have extreme difficulty contributing to oral discussions during the residency training because they have been taught to listen but not speak. Programs can help facilitate IMG integration by presenting rules, customs, and expectations as clearly as possible during any orientations and other available forums. Current international residents or faculty within your institution may be persuaded to lead small group presentations and discussions about their native country's views of medicine, as well as their experience integrating into the U.S. medical system. The concern among current medical leaders is about how tolerant young physicians will be of the challenge that now faces medicine. And that challenge is to build viable medical communities and working teams of physicians. Surveys of young physicians suggest that they perform as a sort of throwback to the show up, do your work, go home mentality. And they can be a kind of lone wolf that doesn't participate in any viable medical community. However, in today's complicated medical workplace, active collaboration and teamwork are a necessity. Therefore, one challenge facing medical leaders is to get young physicians to participate in medical community building. Bridging dialogue between the generations requires a stretch from everyone's perspective towards the other generations. Certainly, if we just think of this as older to younger and younger to older communication, then older physicians need to demonstrate an inquisitiveness. They need to get beyond any notion of stereotyping or shaming young physicians for having a different work ethic. They need to learn to mentor without micromanaging. What seems to work best is if older physicians have an open-door policy that allows free access and free flow of information, while at the same time maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. Asking the young physician about career plans, personal events, satisfaction, and preferences also seems to be a big rapport builder that older physicians can offer. Younger physicians, on the other hand, need to learn to be respectful of the kinds of notions older physicians hold dear. Older physicians have been taught to judge whether or not a younger person has been taught appropriate values based on things like a firm handshake, use of appropriate titles, and certainly showing up on time, and demonstrating a willingness to accept responsibility for full patient care in medicine. One of the challenges for younger physicians is to demonstrate that they are fully committed professionals who embrace the calling of being a physician and still have a controlled lifestyle. It's also important to recognize that older physicians value being consulted and respected enough to have younger physicians seek their advice and counsel. Younger physicians should be made aware of the pioneering efforts of the older physicians that have gone before them, and that the benefits that they now have were derived from those pioneering efforts, though times have changed.
Building bridges across the generations involves developing working philosophies that embrace generational differences around divisive issues like duty hours, leave time, educational requirements, professionalism, conflict resolution, and deadlines. In practical terms, the steps we can take are: 1, to work together to design the best method for implementing national resident work hour limitations. 2, be sensitive to demands that meetings not take place during family time. 3, find methods for providing rewards for overtime or evening or weekend call time. 4, keep in mind generational biases when evaluating residents. And 5, find ways to make the specialties that don't allow for as much time control, such as surgery and anesthesia, more younger generation friendly. Other methods of encouraging bridge building between generations are to address the possibility of alternative methods to the classroom modality for presenting information. Students may work on laptops during lectures, a practice that teachers often find disrespectful or distracting, but this is probably going to be a trend that won't go away. So we need to find ways to embrace the technology while also being clear about when laptops are not appropriate. Ask both teachers and trainees for their input on how to evaluate performance and judge advancement. Consider redefining professionalism as the essential qualities of a physician to deliver care with quality, honesty, and integrity. This definition provides a common ground for different generations to agree on, as opposed to equating professionalism with the number of hours worked. In summary, building bridges between the generations requires effort on everyone's part. I think it's important to develop an attitude of curiosity while bearing in mind that you have to match before you can lead. An understanding of who you're trying to influence and whose perspective you are trying to broaden is vitally important to success in this endeavor. Just remember that the best coaches and teachers and leaders have a deep understanding of the people they're trying to lead. Secondly, it's important to be aware of your own biases when dealing with generational issues. When encountering a misunderstanding or an outcome that is other than the one we want or intended in a personal situation, what tends to happen next is all or nothing thinking. Labeling, blaming, shaming, stereotyping, discounting, scapegoating are all indications of mismanaged personal biases. I was never treated with this sort of understanding when I was in training usually signals an older physician who is struggling with something that needs to be examined and resolved. Third, it's important to model appropriate limit setting and psychological boundaries when dealing with generational issues. The message here certainly is not, let's coddle the younger physicians and make their lives easier. Maybe we do need to soften some of the edges that have been the tradition in medical education. But it's also appropriate and important to teach anyone that you are mentoring or training or working with what it takes to get along with you while maintaining a broad mind and an open heart about what you need to learn to best get along with the other person you are teaching or training. A fourth summary point is that we need to develop philosophies that help us to face the challenge of bridging dialogue between the generations. Understanding that this is a universal process that requires efforts from all generations, and keeping in mind that each generation tends to improve upon the work of the last generation, both in personal and professional settings, can also be helpful.
Hello, Dr. Mangum.
Oh, hello, Dr. Fuller. Well, I certainly hope you're on your way to a beach party or whatever type of party you young people are into these days, considering how you're dressed. Can I show you the way out?
Well, no, these are my casual clothes for days when I don't see patients.
Oh, I certainly hope not. Young man, do you realize that I can have you dismissed for dress like this? I don't see how you even dare walk in the front door when you know that you're a resident and you're expected to have a professional appearance. It floors me what young people try to get away with. When I was a resident, I wouldn't have dared to even be in the vicinity of the hospital without a tie. Unbelievable.
Styles of dress are constantly changing. The professional attire from many years ago would not be the same as today's, and in fact would look out of place for a physician to wear. Program directors need to be able to look past the different styles and focus only on what is allowed and not allowed, as stated in the hospital or institutional dress code policy. It may be helpful for this policy to contain specific statements addressing exposed skin, piercings, facial hair, and appropriate footwear. It may also contain statements about denim, T-shirts, sandals, and logos. Stating that dress and appearance should always be professional may not be clear enough because different generations may have different views of what looks professional.
Oh, hello, Dr. Fuller. Say, how's the orientation going for you so far?
Pretty well, but
Good.
there's lots of paperwork.
Well, I hope you get something out of it. You know, one of the goals of the orientation is to show you the ropes, to help you know our culture and our patients' expectations. Residents usually do everything they can to make sure that the patient feels completely at ease. Everything from how to greet patients to what residents wear. Check back with me about what you learn.
Dr. Quinn, here are your duty hours for this quarter.
Dr. Stein, my religious faith requires that I pray several times a day and from 1:30 to 2 on Fridays. I will need to be excused and have another resident cover me during those times.
Dr. Quinn, I'm surprised by this request. Didn't you realize that medicine was a 24/7 career? I don't care what religion you are. As physicians, we need to be able to work when we are needed. As soon as you chose medicine as your career, you made all other commitments, family, religion, secondary. You can't make personal requests like this during your residency training period, while you're still relying on others to train you. What about your colleagues? Did you ever think about the imposition on them to have to cover for you all this time?
I guess I didn't.
Obviously you did not.
As our medical world becomes more diverse with more international graduates and residents from generations that want to be able to maintain a work-life balance, the question of how to accommodate different religions will be coming to the forefront of residency programs. The faith tradition may be a defined piety such as Muslim, Jewish, Christian, or other spiritual religions less well recognized. Some issues that may need to be addressed or even accommodated may be how to observe a weekly Sabbath or holy days, or how to fast or eat while respecting dietary restrictions. It may be helpful to have consultants or pastoral counselors from different faith traditions. Perhaps the chaplains that serve your patients would be available to talk to residents about how to integrate their spirituality into their profession, either formally through a conference or informally. Many residents may be new to the community and may not have arrived with established ties. The clearer you are about your expectations, the better. An example of stating your expectations might be, you will need to be on call for X number of weekends, including Saturdays or Sundays. Will you be able to do this? Religious accommodations in residency training are a current topic of discussion within the AMA as well as the ACGME.
I'm glad you told me about this up front. You'll probably want to trade with another resident for Friday afternoons. Go ahead and see if you can work the trade with one of the other residents, and then come back to me and tell me what trades you've made. As for this several times a day praying, help me understand how we could help you get the time you'd like while fulfilling your patient care responsibilities. Could you do it if we found you a private space within the hospital where you could go when you had a few minutes during the day? Tell me what you think would happen if you had a planned prayer time and one of your patients became unstable.
Well, of course I would notify my area that I was in prayer and make sure that there was another resident that I could rely on who could take care of matters while I was praying.
Fantastic. Always putting the patient first.
Of course.
Wonderful.